My special guest today is Mauro Guillén, Ph.D. Mauro is the author of the new book, 2030, How Today's Biggest Trends Will Collide and Reshape the Future of Everything. It is already widely praised. Cal Newport, author of Deep Work, calls it convincing and compelling. And Angela Duckworth, best-selling author of Grit, says the book is, quote, a brilliant exploration of trends that will change the way we live, work, and play. Dr. Guillén is one of the most original thinkers at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, where he holds the Zandman Professorship in International Management and teaches its flagship Advanced Management program and many other courses for executives, MBAs, and undergraduates. An expert on global market trends, he's a sought-after speaker and consultant. He combines his training as a sociologist at Yale and a business economist in his native Spain to methodically identify and quantify the most promising opportunities at the intersection of demographic, economic, and technological developments. Dr. Guillén, welcome to the Go for Launch podcast.
Thank you for having me, Brandon.
All right. Well, through the power of technology, I saw that Dr. Guillén was releasing a book in August, so it's fresh out on the market. And I reached out to him and thought, no way this Wharton professor is going to get back to me. And within an hour or so, you had got back to me. So thank you for your being gracious and agreeing to do this interview in the first place.
Thank you for inviting me. I always reply to email very fast. I may be succinct when I reply, but I always reply.
Very good. Well, I want to first ask you, what was the genesis of the new book and when exactly did you start writing it?
So I started doing research for the book about 7 years ago. So I'm a public speaker. I make a lot of presentations in front of different kinds of audiences, like high school students all the way up to company executives. And I detected about 7 years ago that people were increasingly concerned about the direction that the world was taking, right? So after the global financial crisis, I think there was a lot of soul searching, trying to figure out what's going on. I mean, populations are getting older, emerging markets are growing, technology is taking over our lives. And I decided, let's, write a book after, of course, doing the analysis in terms of crunching numbers. And I did, of course, in the last few months, update the trends regarding how the pandemic is affecting the overall picture of what the future is going to look like.
Yeah, I noticed that. I was going to say next, you're releasing it at a crazy time. And of course, doing a book takes a long time. You mentioned it's been 7 or 8 years in the making. And now you have a big epilogue at the end that kind of says, by the way, this book is coming out right during COVID. So how did the pandemic affect the book as it's coming out right now?
Yeah, so we've had, since I started writing this book, several, disruptions that have affected the world. A very important one, whenever you're writing about economic topics, of course, is the increasing tensions and frictions among countries, like, for example, the US-China war. So I was prepared, right, to deal with these unexpected things that can always happen while you're embarking on a 6 or 7 year project, right, because you need to consider a lot of evidence. But essentially, what I've found over the last few months is that the trends that I analyze in the book, they get accelerated, they get intensified by the pandemic. Only 2 of them, and I'm happy to share with you which ones they are, tend to be either slowed down or perhaps will be reversed by the pandemic. But all of the others, like the vast majority of the trends that I discuss in the book, the pandemic, if anything, accelerates them, intensifies them. So in other words, the future will come, sooner than we think. And my only regret, to tell you the truth, is that instead of calling the book 2030, I perhaps now would give it the title 2028.
Oh, wow. Because I was going to say 2030 is not that far off, really, right?
Oh.
But in many respects, according to you especially, the world will look dramatically different in just 10 years from now. In fact, you write, and I'm going to quote this, the world as we know it today will be gone by 2030. Now, Mauro, that is a bold statement. So can you give us an idea of what is going away and what is going to replace it?
The world as we know it, Brandon, is coming to an end. Look, we're going to have for the first time, more or less by the year 2030, more grandparents than grandchildren. Now think about what that means, right? You and I grew up And most families in the United States, there would be way more grandchildren than the 4 grandparents. And also keep in mind that, generations ago, not all of the grandparents would actually be alive by the time the grandchildren were born. Mm-hmm. But today, the grandparents are alive, right? And there's very few grandchildren, right? So for the first time, we have more of the former than the latter. And that has enormous implications for all sorts of things. So that's one example among many of the facts that are going to create a completely different situation. The world you and I grew up in, that world is gone, right? And by the year 2030, it will be unrecognizable from today's standpoint.
Another fact that I saw in the book is that currently the United States and Europe are the 2 biggest markets globally. However, by 2030, you say that 2 other countries are going to take our place at the top. Who are those countries?
So those are China and India in that order. Although by the year 2040 or 2050, India will become a bigger consumer market than China. And that's because the middle class is expanding, both in terms of numbers of people and their average incomes in those markets. Whereas here in the United States, or in Europe for that matter, as you know, the middle class is stagnant, unfortunately. Something that is having, of course, profound political consequences.
Yeah, and the other thing that I was really interested in about those 2 countries that you mentioned, China and India, which we hear a lot about here, but we don't necessarily think as deeply as we should about, they're also outpacing the U.S. about 70 times when it comes to patenting new products and inventions. I was blown away by that statistic. And you also wrote that the truth is there are more broadband, social media, and mobile payment users in China or in India than in the United States. And the gap
Absolutely.
will only continue to widen. So again, to people who are myopic in the U.S., thinking that we're the superior technological country, we're not.
Well, absolutely. So other countries are catching up. And of course, the issue is that they're much bigger in terms of population. So they're getting their act together. They're growing. They are developing all of these technologies that you mentioned. And they are increasingly making those technologies available to a very large proportion of their populations. So China and India have 1.3 billion people, and we barely have 400 million, right? They're much bigger. We are much richer yet, but they are making progress really, really quickly, economically and technologically.
Other parts of the world that you opened my eyes about were South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, which you say by 2020 will be the most populous regions in the world. And like many people, I would have assumed that that was East Asia, like China, South Korea, Japan, but you said that's wrong.
Yeah.
So, but the biggest implication for that, Dr. Guillén, is that you said that basically the center of consumer spending is going to be moving to South Asia and Africa. What will the impact of that be globally?
Well, the impact will be, as you mentioned earlier, that innovation, that new product development, new product launches are going to be driven by the largest markets, the same way that over the last 100 years or so, first Europe and then the United States were essentially calling the shots when it came to consumer markets, to innovation, to technological development. So essentially, we're going to see, kind of a migration of the center of gravity in the world. It's going to shift away from the North Atlantic Ocean and towards first East Asia, and then very quickly towards South Asia and even Sub-Saharan Africa, because as you know, I'm also very bullish on what's going to happen in Sub-Saharan Africa. I think they're putting behind them many of the problems that they used to have, and now they are becoming like really, really dynamic from an economic point of view.
Nice. And I also love that you really broke down this idea about immigration not being an evil thing, but actually a positive for the economy, especially in America. And I think in the next 10 years, if I'm reading the book correctly, we're really going to rely on those countries like Africa and other countries that are actually having more babies than we are to export children to our country to do jobs, correct?
Well, yes. I mean, as our own population gets older on average, we're going to need more young people. And most immigrants tend to be young. But it's not only that. Also, remember, between 25% and 35% of the doctors and nurses and healthcare specialists that we employ in this country were born outside of the United States. So we're not going to be able to cope with the public health crisis of tomorrow. We're not going to be able to offer good, affordable healthcare to our senior citizens without immigration. It's really, really important. And then, of course, let's not forget, many Silicon Valley startups are founded by immigrants. Google, Tesla, you name them, right? So I think it is a source of strength rather than a sign that we are declining as a society. And so I think, hopefully what we should do is have a good debate at the national level that is not polarizing, but rather that tries to understand what the issues are regarding immigration.
Yeah, and you spent a lot of time, gratefully, in the book going through a lot of various statistics that demonstrate that, for example, the fear people have that immigrants come and take our jobs is largely unfounded. In fact, the low-income jobs that immigrants do are not the ones that low-income Americans typically do, as one thing. So, I, again, thought the book was very illuminating in that respect.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Immigrants, essentially come in two types. So one is, as you mentioned, people without an education who essentially have to use their physical labor, and that we don't have enough Americans, who are willing to do that. And then at the other end, we also have large numbers of immigrants coming in with advanced degrees, like in medicine or in engineering and so on. And we also don't produce enough. Physicians or enough engineers here in this country. So immigration is a complement. It's not a substitute for American workers.
Well, I love it. You came here from Spain. My ancestors came here in 1893 from England. So, everybody comes from somewhere else, typically, if you go back a little bit far enough. But,
that is true. That is true. So I came here to this country more than 30 years ago, and now I am an American citizen. And of course, people may think that I'm biased when I talk about immigration. But, the data, I think, are very clear that the American economy and the United States as a country has benefited immensely from immigration. And by the way, take a look at our military. So people sign up for the Army, the Navy, or the Air Force. We don't have conscription here. A disproportionate proportion, a very large proportion of immigrants or children of immigrants then volunteer for the American Armed Forces. So, immigrants also make a really important contribution to national security.
Yeah, absolutely. And, what you really suggested to me as a reader is that it's perhaps time for me to start reaching across the pond and making connections in places like Africa or India that I may not have thought about before. And fortunately, we have a plethora of tools at our fingertips, Skype that we're on right now, LinkedIn, you name it. So I think that people who are, open-minded and thinking differently are going to embrace technology to bridge that gap and think, well, how can we work together?
Absolutely. Now think about it this way, Brandon, which is, look, the fastest growing economies in the world are those in the emerging markets. That's why they're called emerging, right? They're growing faster than we are. If we don't engage with them, if we don't try to sell our products and our services there, but rather we turn, domestic and we protect and we just forget about the rest of the world, we're going to be losing perhaps our best chance at growing. Because if we can serve those markets with our products and services, then we will be able to create more jobs here in the United States and the economy will grow faster. So I think we need to change our mindset. Our mindset should be, yes, we need to make it possible for people in the United States to have a greater standard of living. We shouldn't leave anybody behind. But the best chance of accomplishing that is to make the American economy competitive and to export as much as we can to those markets that are growing very quickly, because the demand from those markets is always going to be growing faster than the demand from inside of the United States.
I think that's phenomenal. Thank you. You also compare, we're talking about technology, you compare where we are with emerging technology to the Cambrian explosion, which was a time when the most major groups of animals started to appear in our fossil records. So what is the big deal right now? And what are the major technological trends that you see dominating over the next 10 years?
Yeah, so we are, I think, in the midst of an explosion in terms of different kinds of technologies. And by the way, most of the ones that I'm about to tell you have not been fully developed or fully implemented So we're in the midst of this explosion, and we're going to see in the next 10 years or so very, very important applications of this technology. So specifically, I have in mind, of course, artificial intelligence and robotics. Everybody has that in mind, but also 3D printing. And quite importantly as well, anything that has to do with virtual reality. And with all of these new fancy platforms, much fancier than the one that we're using right now, which are being developed, that will help us work together, learn together from a distance, right? And also play together, right? Entertain ourselves together, spend time with friends and family when we cannot travel. So I think what we're going through is one of these unique periods in history when, within 10 years, 15 years, you see massive change, especially from a technological point of view.
One of the things that struck me in the book, you talked about how much of growth in society is kind of viewed in linear fashion. People think one thing leads to the next. But you argue that breakthroughs really occur when somebody doesn't do that, but they kind of throw out the rule book. And you talk about one of your Wharton colleagues who has this concept called peripheral vision. Can you explain what that is and how that can be applied?
Yeah, so peripheral vision has to do with looking at the lateral connection, not the linear connection, right? So I'm looking at this part of what's going on in the world right now, this trend, and instead of just trying to analyze that trend in huge detail, I see how that trend relates to something else in a completely different, part of the global economy or of the world. And essentially, what you're trying to look is for connections, right, between things that at first appear to be unrelated, that then open up a huge opportunity, right? So let me just give you a quick example. The gulf between generations. So we have younger people and we have a lot of people above the age of 60, right? Mm-hmm. And those two generations seem to be at odds with one another because, some of them want bigger pensions, but then of course the younger people say, well, but if we give you a bigger pension, that means I'm going to have to pay more taxes over my lifetime. So there are entrepreneurs, especially social entrepreneurs in many different parts of the world, that are trying to bring together these two generational groups. So for example, there is this brilliant idea of the senior college dorm, where senior citizens will actually interact and live together with college students to the benefit of both. So you would provide the college students with a lower rent or even with some payments for, spending time with the senior citizens, but also the senior citizens could help the students. Because senior citizens have knowledge and experience that can be shared, right? Yes. So again, yes, we see this increasing gulf between generations in the world, but there are solutions that essentially put together the two and two and help us improve the situation.
That is so funny because you mentioned this movie in the book that Robert De Niro was in, The Intern, where he's this 70-something-year-old guy, going back to work and all the hilarity that ensues. I've seen this myself personally over the summer. I've taken a couple college courses at a local community college, and some of the interaction between myself and the Gen Zers has been hysterical. Even the professors using analogies that the younger people have no idea what they're talking about. So it was kind of funny. Look,
I mean, we have spent, I think, the last 50 years trying to separate the generations.
Yes.
So we say you study until this time, you work, and then you retire, all of these things. And I think we have to adopt just the opposite principle, which is let's create connections across generations, as opposed to try to demarcate them and to separate them in terms of their life experiences.
Definitely. Well, let's talk some more about the generational gap, because we hear so much about millennials until we're all having eyeball rolls. And, one of the things that I love that you wrote was that the fuss about millennials is overblown. And actually the quote, gray market or gray is the new black. So, hey, as someone with a lot of gray, you said that we're at the age of the gray market. And this is one that's growing in spending power, especially in those same emerging economies you talked about. But you also referenced the fact that the Boston Consulting Group said that only 1 in 7 companies is prepared for this graying of the market. What do we need to expect, Mauro, in terms of the population aging? And what is that going to do for us over the next 10 years?
Well, it's going to create the largest segment of the market in terms of consumption. And also keep in mind, here in the United States, for example, 80% of the wealth of the net worth is owned by people above the age of 60. So this is not to say that everybody above that age is rich. Of course not. There's a lot of inequality. But they're the ones who own a home. They're the ones who have savings. They're the ones who have pension funds. And they're becoming the largest segment of the market. And you see, companies for the longest time have forgotten about them, to the point that many of them actually neglected that segment because they thought younger people wouldn't like the brand if it also appealed to older people. So some clothing companies, for example, for years and years and years, rejected the idea of having merchandise in their stores that would be good for people in their 60s or 70s, out of fear that younger consumers would be turned away, right? And that has to change first and foremost for something that we haven't discussed yet, which is that a 70-year-old today is not the same as a 70-year-old 50 years ago, right? We now stay in better shape. We have better lifestyles. And so a 70-year-old today is like a 45 or 50-year-old 50 years ago, right?
Yeah.
The concept of what is old and what is young is changing very quickly. And I think we need to adjust, and companies and brands also need to adapt to that new situation.
Absolutely. So if I do the math right, you and I are both the same age, 55,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so according to conventional wisdom, Mauro, you and I should be retiring in 10 years, in 2030, at the ripe age of 65.
Right.
What do you have to say about that in light of things?
Well, I'm not retiring. No chance I'm retiring. I love doing this too much. But also, look, life expectancy has grown, right? So when the retirement age was set in Europe, that was when it first happened, at 65 years, average life expectancy was no more than 45.
Wow.
So, the politicians of the time were very smart because they thought, we're going to promise to people that they can enjoy a pension once they turn 65. But, very few of the workers would actually reach 65. But today, the situation is quite the opposite. When people like yourself or myself reach age 65, we're still, energetic. We're still, ambitious. We're still thinking about continuing our career or even launching another career. And we may still have another 10 or 15 years of productive work life. So why retire? I think retirement is oversold. I think the best thing in life is to remain active, to work, also to play and to have fun. But I think 65 is an artificial threshold. Now, some people may want to take advantage of it. Fine. But I don't think, we should live by that standard. I think most of us will continue to work and be very happy doing so for, another 5, 10, even 15 years beyond 65.
I agree. And I think, most of the people I know are making it to 80s, so you could go 20 years. You don't want to play golf every day. That's just going to get boring quickly, right? So, well, let me do this. I want to play a lightning round of topics, some of the hot topics that you mentioned, or technologies. So, Mauro, I'll throw out a word and then let you speak about it for a minute or two. All right?
Okay.
How's that sound? All right. Virtual reality.
Virtual reality was something that I thought would only be helpful in terms of playing video games. But boy, it's going to change our lives. It's going to help us stay in touch with family. It's going to help us work and collaborate with others. It's going to help us enjoy entertainment from a distance. And by the way, it's also going to help us live longer because it's excellent as a therapy, right?
Yes.
Virtual reality can help you overcome mental illness. So for example, people who suffer from dementia or who have early signs of Alzheimer's, if they use therapy based on virtual reality, they can delay the symptoms of the disease. So virtual reality is going to be huge.
Okay. All right. How about this? Airbnb as a retirement strategy.
Well, before this crisis, but I think things are going to go back to where we were. Airbnb was great for senior citizens because they have space to rent and maybe they need the money. But not only that, as you know, the biggest problem once you turn 65 or 70 is that maybe you become lonely. And that's why I think it's important to keep on working. So a lot of people about that age decide to list their property on Airbnb as a way to be able to socialize with others, with the guests. They enjoy that. So it's a vaccine against loneliness.
I love that too, because I never thought about it. A lot of people, when they get to that age, the kids have moved out, they're empty nesters, they have a big house, and typically people start to downsize. But that's where many people have the most money, is in the equity of their home. So to be able to get that out by renting out an extra room or two, brilliant strategy. How about the sharing economy?
So the sharing economy is, synonym with Airbnb and with Uber, but it's not just that. I think we need to move beyond that. Sharing has enormous potential, for example, to help us cope with climate change. We waste so much stuff. And if we shared more through some of these platforms, including clothing, by the way, we don't share a lot of clothing. We waste a lot of it. We also waste about, according to the US government, 32% of the food that we produce in the US. We waste it at the point of consumption. So sharing could help us, for example, share cans of food before they expire. We purchase too many and we can't eat them. I think the sharing economy will help us more than anything else, for example, overcome the problem of climate change and the problem of environmental abuse of natural resources.
All right. One more I'll throw out there. Nanotechnology.
So nanotechnology is all of these things that scientists are doing to come up with better materials, materials that last longer, materials that have certain characteristics that make them easier to manufacture or to manipulate. So this is going to be huge, and we're only at the beginning of this. So we're going to have better clothes, better cars, more resistant cars, more fuel-efficient cars. We're also going to have better insulating materials for the home, thanks to nanotechnology. So I think this is going to be the biggest game changer besides the human genome and biotech and all of these DNA-based treatments. I think nanotechnologies will make us more efficient, will also help us cope with climate change. And more importantly, I think it will help us respect the environment a little bit more.
Right. So what was the movie where I think it was Dustin Hoffman was in it, and the future was plastics, right?
Yes.
So the future now is probably stuff like nanotechnology, if we're being honest with ourselves, right? By the
Exactly,
way,
not plastics.
Yeah, because you mentioned the fact that I didn't realize this. Much of our plastics used to go to China, and that was part of the trade deal. And a lot of that's not happening now. So there's a lot of uncertainty about where a lot of waste is actually going to end up, which is disturbing.
Yeah, absolutely. China, a couple of years ago, refused to take more recycled plastic from the US because they don't need it anymore. But also, by the way, because they're also producing a lot of plastic themselves, right? And wasting a lot of it because now their consumer market is bigger. Plastics, as you know, are a big problem, and they show up in the oceans in the form of microplastics. The environment doesn't degrade them. It takes like hundreds of years. So that's where nanotechnology also comes along. So we can develop new materials that we can use to replace plastics. And these materials will be more durable. But also, if we throw them away, they will decay faster, and they will not pollute the environment as much as conventional plastics.
I love that. You also wrote in the book, quote, "None of us can predict the future, but we can approach it wisely." I love that. You also express a lot of optimism for the future in the book. What gives you positive vibes, if you will, as you look ahead to 2030?
Well, what gives me optimism is that you see every big change, every huge transformation is an opportunity. It's not just a threat. So what we need to do is to adopt a mindset that is all about, okay, where's the opportunity here? As opposed to, oh my goodness, how's life going to change for me? What kind of a threat am I going to be able to confront? So I think, they call it sometimes positive thinking. I think it's just having a mindset that is more geared towards problem solving and towards identifying opportunities, as opposed to a more, reactionary kind of mindset or culture where, anything that changes instantly triggers this instinct of, oh, that must be a threat to my way of life.
Right.
So I think it's all about the mindset.
I love that. And I guess it goes back to the peripheral vision that you and your colleagues espouse, that we shouldn't just be, have tunnel vision and be thinking linearly all the time. We need to think outside, our typical ways of doing things. We've been speaking with Mauro Guillén, professor at Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, about his new book. 2030, How Today's Biggest Trends Will Collide and Reshape the Future of Everything. It is a really fantastic read. Where can people go to learn more about you and get a copy of the book?
Well, they can come to my website, www.mauroguillén, without any spaces, .com. They can also Google my name. And of course, the book is available from everywhere where books are sold. So both online and also at independent bookstores throughout the country.
Outstanding. And I'll also include a link over to your website at our show notes page at goforlaunch.io/show100. By the way, you have hit the 100 mark for me. So thank you so much for being a milestone in my podcasting journey.
That's an honor. And of course, I will also add a link to your podcast on my website.
Oh, I love it. Well, thank you so much. Are there any parting words of wisdom that you'd like to share? I'm just digging into the book continually because there's just nuggets of wisdom that are just jumping off the pages.
I think the overarching message is that, look, change is in the nature of things. We're always going through transformations. It is, I think, our luck and maybe also the challenge before us that we will be going through a very intense period of change over the next 10 years. So once again, embrace change. Take the current wherever it takes you. That's what William Shakespeare used to write about, right? Don't try to swim against the stream. Try to look for a way to bring everyone on board. Yes, there is a new world that is, forming just before our eyes. We need to adapt to it. And we need to adopt this problem-solving mindset.
Perfect. Thank you so much for summing that up, and I wish you the best of luck with the book.
Thank you so much for having me on your podcast.